Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times with me, Adrian Goldberg, joined by our Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov, and executive editor, Peter Jukes. This is an edition being recorded live via Substack and asking whether Sir Keir Starmer might be brought down by his misplaced confidence in Peter Mandelson, the now disgraced Labour peer who Starmer appointed as the UK's ambassador to the United States, despite knowing that he maintained a friendship with convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. It's a row which goes to the heart of government, with the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Morgan Mcsweeney, said to have pushed for Mandelson to be given the job. In a blow to Starmer's authority, his former deputy, Angela Rayner, led a successful backbench rebellion, forcing information about the process behind the appointment to be released by the Joint Intelligence and Security Committee rather than via senior civil servants close to the PM. The release of the most recent tranche of documents relating to Epstein by the US Department of Justice suggests that Mandelson, then Gordon Brown's business secretary, tipped off the US financier about a $500 billion bailout of the euro following the financial crash of 2010. A year earlier, he appeared to give Epstein advance information about a £20 billion sale of government assets. Mandelson also appears to lobby against a tax on bankers' bonuses at Epstein's request, unsuccessfully, as it turned out, in 2009. He has now quit Labour and the Lords over his links to Epstein, who apparently paid him a total of $75,000 in three separate payments in 2003-2004, a gift he later said he couldn't remember. Mandelson is now being investigated by the Metropolitan Police, but is understood to argue that he has not acted criminally and that did not act for personal gain. There are many other serious strands to the Epstein case, not least the rape, sexual abuse and trafficking of girls, who should always remain in our thoughts. But could this one story bring down the Starmer government? The PM came out fighting today with a speech in Hastings, apologising to Epstein's victims and restating the case for a Labour government. But his judgment and therefore his authority are now being called into question by some of his own MPs. As I say, we've got Byline Times executive editor Peter Jukes with us and Adam Bienkov, Byline Times political editor. Adam, straightforward question. Is this the end of Starmer?
Well, I think it's incredibly serious, and it really starting to remind me of the kind of end days of Boris Johnson's premiership, albeit we're only a year and a half into Keir Starmer's premiership. And I think it's incredibly serious. I've been playing a lot of chess recently, and in chess there's a thing called a forcing move, where you force your opponent into taking a move they don't really want to take just to save themselves. And I think that's where we could be at the moment with Keir Starmer and his chief advisor, Morgan Mcsweeney. He doesn't want to get rid of Morgan Mcsweeney. He said yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions that he remains committed. He has full confidence in him. But I think we are getting to the point where he's going to have very few moves left that he can take in order to save his premiership. But the problem with a forcing move in chess is that once you take that move, you often end up in a weaker position. And although there is an opportunity for Starmer to change the leadership of his senior team, get a fresh start again, Mcsweeney and Starmer are so inextricably linked as a pair that I think were Mcsweeney to fall, then it could leave Starmer himself in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah, that sense that maybe Mcsweeney, because we are led to understand that he did push for the appointment of Mandelson as ambassador to United States, that he could perhaps be the fall guy, but nevertheless, Starmer sanctioned that appointment. Starmer has placed his trust, as you said, he mentioned it again in the Commons yesterday, placed his trust in Mcsweeney. So what is left of Starmer? And you made a point in a recent podcast with us, Adam, that in essence, the Starmer project is the Mcsweeney project. There's almost no Starmer project without Mcsweeney.
Well, there's a very interesting book by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund called Get In, about the how the Starmer project came into being. And it's very clear from reading that account how central McSweeney is to everything that has happened. And he is quoted, McSweeney, in the book as suggesting that Keir Starmer is like a toddler at the front of a driverless train thinking that they're driving it. And I think that's in some ways quite a fair description of their relationship. So that's why it becomes incredibly difficult, I think, were he to go. We saw the difficulties that Keir Starmer got himself into at the start of his premiership with Sue Gray. She was ultimately forced out by, we understand, not just Morgan McSweeney, but also Peter Mandelson had a key role in getting rid of Sue Gray as well. So were McSweeney to go, who would be able to then step in and take that place? Because the main complaint that Labour MPs and ministers have with the Prime Minister is that there isn't a clear sense of direction of his government. What direction there has been of his government has come from Morgan McSweeney. It hasn't come from Keir Starmer. And often the difficulties that the Prime Minister has got himself into has been where his own instincts have been different to those of McSweeney. I think the best example of that is the two-child benefit cap, where as we understood it, the Prime Minister was keen to lift the two-child benefit cap, but was persuaded against it by McSweeney. Also, in the Mandelson appointment, Starmer, those around Starmer have been briefing that he wasn't keen on appointing Peter Mandelson, but again was persuaded into doing so by Morgan McSweeney. So they're often at odds, and that's often caused problems. It would make more sense for Starmer to have an advisor who is more closely aligned to his own politics. The problem, I think, is that it's not entirely clear what his own politics are, given how sort of wildly that has vacillated over the last couple of years.
And I mentioned the move by backbenchers, including his former deputy, Angela Rayner, to ensure that the release of documents relating to this, which is very sensitive because there's an ongoing police inquiry, there may be redactions needed in order to protect UK security sources and so on. It is genuinely a sensitive issue. Starmer said in his common statement yesterday that he intended for those documents to be released, not by him, but by senior civil servants close to him. But Angela Rayner and others have forced a now familiar word in relation to Starmer, a U-turn. And it's going to be the Joint Intelligence and Security Committee that is going to oversee that. Obviously, they'll have a very good eye for what is and isn't sensitive with regard to national security. They will still have to be mindful of a potential police prosecution, but nevertheless that undermines Starmer's authority, if only because it's now a different process than the one that he originally prescribed.
Yeah, so the original process, the humble address that the Conservatives brought forward to try and force the publication of these files, the government put forward their own amendment, which would have restricted release not just of issues of national security, but also of international relations. Now, he was the ambassador to the US, so pretty much everything that he did in the job would have been restricted from release. They've now been forced to U-turn, as they often are, on that issue, and it's now being, as you say, going to this committee, which I think is very well placed to decide that line of what can and can't be released, and there's precedent for doing that. I think that's probably the best case scenario for Starmer. It could have been worse. They could be forced to release. I think ultimately a lot of this is going to be delayed because of the police investigation. But I think whatever comes out, there's going to be more awkward questions. And I do think we're kind of in this kind of rolling game now, much as it was with, as I say, Boris Johnson towards the end of his term, where every day brings more difficulties. You get one forcing move after another forcing move, to bring back the chess analogy, and ultimately you end up getting checkmated with or without your queen beside you. And I think that's where we're heading right now when it comes to Starmer, when it comes to McSweeney.
Do you share that analysis, Peter?
Yes, and just remind me never to play chess against Adam. I do. I mean, I think it is somewhat different from Boris Johnson in that, apart from the McSweeney issue and those U-turns, my feeling is there's more competence in the cabinet, and there's no personal enrichment. Well, there is for Mandelson, obviously, for Starmer in the same way that there was, the various wallpaper gate, all the crony contracts to associates. And the other thing is, and this is where, we've just had 10 years of turbulence, haven't we? And this is just more of it. And some of the reasons for that turbulence go back to Epstein, but we'll hold that for a moment. Let's remember a whole summer, a whole year, where Theresa May could not get a bill through the House, endless rebellions. And so I completely share Adam's analysis. The only other thing, some positive note I put, is that actually something's happened here. You know what I mean? In America, where most of those connections are, Trump is maintaining this sort of, it's all fake, doesn't seem to be touching Vance. The new Fed chairman's in the Epstein emails, but he's still, the nomination's still going ahead. Whereas here, yeah, it is up there with the major crisis. I mean, I think Boris should be a major crisis, especially as foreign secretary, going to a bunga bunga party to seek a back channel to Putin after Skripal. But this is a sense that things are coming to the light. And I trust Adam's analysis about, it's unpredictable where it rolls. And I see his very salient point that Mweeny is a firewall. And if he goes, Starmer is next. I was thinking briefly of an analogy with a similar situation with Andy Coulson. Do you remember? So, Cameron was told, and Cameron said, I gave him a second chance. He lied to me. This is Mandelson's third chance.
Yeah.
And I think that's Adam's point is terrifying and well made. We know Cameronism had a whole project apart from Andy Coulson, right? Andy Coulson did not create David Cameron and George Osborne, the coalition. And if, as these books suggest, Mweeny is the driving force and ideological backbone for Starmer, or provides one, then that moment of getting getting rid of Sue Gray, and I didn't know that, Adam, that Mandelson had hand of that, was a clear strategic and now looks like a catastrophic mistake at the very beginning of Starmer's government.
Starmer's line so far in terms of defending himself against this is to say he couldn't possibly have known that Peter Mandelson was lying to him. Well, we've got to remind ourselves, this is a politician whose public nicknames are the Prince of Darkness and the Dark Lord. I mean, surely the clues were there. This is someone, as Peter said, who'd had to resign twice from government. Surely the clues were there that you couldn't take him 100% at his word. Because as far as we can tell, the vetting process that went before his appointment is these concerns were raised by the PET team in the Cabinet Office that he had stayed with Epstein. This was put to Mandelson by those around Keir Starmer. And the suggestion, the implication, although they're not said so explicitly, is that Mandelson was not honest about that. They wouldn't say yesterday, I put a question to them, did Peter Mandelson deny staying at Epstein? They would not say that he denied it, but there's just that he was dishonest. But surely the Prime Minister, given Peter Mandelson's long record of dishonesty and scandal, shouldn't have taken him at his word. I think it's pretty obvious from all of this that they were pretty well aware of who Peter Mandelson was. They're pretty well aware, maybe not to this extent, but they knew there was a close relationship there with Epstein. They made the calculation that didn't matter as much as getting the man they wanted in to be the US ambassador in front of Trump. And getting that good relationship with Trump was more important than any scandal that may come down further down the line. That seems to be.
I'm just wondering a further point that maybe they thought that was an advantage. Mandelson had to deal with Trump. If Mandelson had these connections with the people around Trump, and Epstein was close to Trump until they fell out, maybe, I don't know, that was parlayed. Maybe you'll see in the documents. Well, I know these people, said Mandelson. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and he certainly was. He got on very well with Trump. I mean, there was that famous video of their encounter, Mandelson and Trump in the Oval Office. They were getting on like a house on fire. So, you can see the logic. I think that what's proven to be a mistake is it wasn't worth the candle in terms of Keir Starmer has got himself into this major scandal that is causing many of his own MPs to consider his future. I just don't think it was worth getting a slightly better relationship with Trump than the otherwise would have done in order for that to happen.
So let's just be clear then that it was acknowledged by Starmer that he was aware that there had been an ongoing friendship between Mandelson and Epstein, but the extent of that ongoing relationship was unknown to them, he said. As Kemi Badenoch pointed out in PMQs, it had actually been reported in the Financial Times.
So back in 2023, these questions first, it was reported by the Financial Times. This is almost 3 years ago now. It was reported that he had stayed at Epstein's flat. I actually put questions about this at the time in 2023 to the Prime Minister's spokesman and said, is this, given what we have learned from the Financial Times, is Peter Mandelson a fit and proper person to be in this role? And they said that we don't have any reason to believe that he is not. Well, that clearly wasn't the case. So this has been a long-standing issue. They've had a long time to get to the bottom of this relationship with Epstein and Mandelson, and they failed to do so. I would suggest it's because they didn't really want to get to the bottom of this relationship.
And the truly new element that came out in the latest tranche of Epstein documents released was the leaking of financially sensitive information, mostly when Mandelson was business secretary in Gordon Brown's government. This is the point at which Starmer says that he betrayed our country, our parliament, and my party. This is the final thing that has damned him, really.
Yes, and in fairness to Downing Street, that information is much more serious. That does take it to another level. From their perspective, they would say we had already sacked Peter Mandelson last September. But yes, you're right. It's incredibly serious. Gordon Brown has spoken out about it. Never one to let a grudge pass. He's been calling for further investigation to Peter Mandelson. So yes, but that then opens up to a whole new world. I'm sure Peter can talk about it more. About some of the business dealings that were going on with Mandelson and his company, Global Counsel. Again, the Global Counsel is the lobbying company set up by Peter Mandelson, which he owns a stake in. One of its clients is Palantir, the tech surveillance company owned by Trump supporting Peter Thiel. When Keir Starmer visited the United States, one of his first trips after meeting the president was to Palantir for a trip which was arranged by Peter Mandelson. We reported this at the Times, Byline Times, and there was no recording of what conversations, no publicly released minutes of what happened during that meeting. The Conservative Party now calling for details of what was discussed during that meeting. Mandelson and Global Counsel also represented a large number of Russian figures, Russian billionaires and oligarchs. Mandelson himself had famously a long-standing close relationship with Oleg Deripaska. There is now suggestions by the Polish Prime Minister that Epstein may have been an agent or an asset for the Russian state. So this then opens the whole issue up. It's Sir Ed Davey, Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, asked directly, are you concerned that you brought in somebody who is close friends with a Russian asset? The Prime Minister said, well, we'll let the investigation go where it needs to go. But these are potentially much more serious questions than what has been released so far. If we are to get to the bottom of them.
Indeed, and there are also suggestions that Epstein was a Mossad agent as well.
Indeed. Yes,
Israeli agent. So these suggestions go pretty deep, Peter.
Yeah. I mean, I think this point about market-moving decisions being leaked direct from a personal email server, direct from cabinet number 10. I've always been concerned around Brexit, and we've talked about this a lot, the hedge funds having insight into, into political decisions, things like Brexit, things like, the prorogation of Parliament, which Crispin Odis seemed to know about in advance on the day Johnson was taking office in 2019. That confluence of money and political power, millions could be made, billions on those decisions. And this is quite staggering, quite beyond belief. And anyway, people have suggested it's criminal. We'll wait and see. I make judgment that way. But in terms of the wider concerns, obviously, Palantir, as we've documented, have over £500 million contracts, starting with the NHS, about 400 million. They've got a big MOD one. Ministry of Defence includes cloud service for our nuclear weapons and various police forces. Now, we've looked at what Palantir has done in the US. With the army, it's sort of found ways of tracing protesters. It is tracing and helping to locate through geolocation, open source. social media, phone calls, migrants. And it looks like the New York Times confirmed our official reporting that was using that ICE, or the Department of Homeland Security, was using Palantir technology to target protesters, 2 of which have been shot dead, obviously, in the last month. So there's concerns about Palantir anyway as a kind of all-in-one tech surveillance kit. And Peter Thiel, who's its founder, he doesn't run it, and a guy called Alex Karp runs it, has spoken out against democracy. He says he's not sure it works. He thinks the Antichrist is coming in a recent series of lectures. He thinks it might be Greta Thunberg. He said the NHS should be abolished. But what we didn't know was quite how close Peter Thiel was to Epstein. And that's what has emerged, many more meetings. And the problem is Epstein keeps on introducing Thiel to Russian agents. I mean, senior Russian agents. Deputy Minister of Finance, a guy called Belyakov, who's FSB trained, Churkin, the UN ambassador in America. All during those years of 2016, Epstein is trying to forge connections with Russia. And we know from all the work that a lot of his money went to Russia, came from Russia. There's hundreds of millions of pounds of payments already detected long before these files to Russia. And so somebody's got all these visas. He has Russian visas, like going over 20 years. There's like 7 passports with visas. And one of the visas is sponsored by this agency, which is run by the KGB, and a KGB former colonel, and it's called a Veterans Association. There is no doubt. And he's constantly tried to meet Putin. He's talking to Ehud Barak, saying, I've talked to Putin. Ehud Barak then talks to Putin. So if he said, did you talk to Epstein? Putin could have said no. So he has, at that level, very high Russian contacts. On the Israeli contacts, and Dave Troy is brilliant on this, he's downloaded all the files, he's been looking at it. There's no doubt, particularly through Ehud Barak, that Israeli, he's head of intelligence. He was former prime minister of Israel. But he has also said, could be cover, in an email to Deepak Chopra, I don't want to go to Israel. I hate that place, right? So he was a secular Jew. The evidence, of course there could be Mossad. There are Mossad connections, particularly through Ehud Barak. But there are so many Russian connections. I mean, they're just unassailable. He's writing to them. He's to St. Petersburg Forum, where he regularly attends, which is their kind of Davos with spies, and saying, we can take over. You can take over the West if you come up with your own Bitcoin currency. You could, and so he could be for both. I mean, he was for Epstein. Let's be clear. Who Jeffrey Epstein was Jeffrey Epstein. But I am still staggered. I call it the Epstein archipelago. Is into royal families in the Gulf, in Scandinavia, and obviously the Prince Andrew here. He's in publishing, he's in art galleries, he's in academia, he's big in Silicon Valley. He's running all these conferences, even after he's convicted as a sex offender. And obviously, he's really big into tech, and there are connections with Musk. It was well documented when he'd come to the island. But even after conviction, Ehud Barak said it's co-owned fund, right? This is this fund. He's a major partner with Peter Thiel, and they're buying up Israeli surveillance tech, a company called Carbine. Meanwhile, in the background, we don't know if Thiel knew about this. We don't know if Mandelson knew about it. He is clearly a big conduit, a big contact with the Kremlin. I think the Mandelson thing is complicated by that. Yes, there's much more evidence of his proximity to Deripaska, who was eventually sanctioned, I think, 2013.
This is Oleg Deripaska.
Oleg Deripaska, a big oligarch who inherited, a lot of those oligarchs did, huge state assets. Deripaska is kind of distant from Putin and then gets back close to, and then is sanctioned, and then very much pro-Putin. What did Mandelson know about the Russian connection? I think that remains open.
Well, one of the interesting releases from these files is a suggestion that Mandelson personally attempted to help Epstein get a visa for Russia, which is particularly interesting in light of what we've now learned.
Yeah.
You mentioned Peter Thiel, Peter. I just think it's worth drawing a line from Peter Thiel to Steve Bannon, who was Trump's publicist in his first election. in his first presidency, at least for a brief period. And Bannon has been closely associated with Nigel Farage. Now, of course, we have to be careful to say we're not insinuating anything improper in terms of Nigel Farage and the horrendous sexual exploitation of which Epstein was responsible. But given the threads and the links that are there between Epstein and so many powerful figures across the world, but particularly in Western politics, I think it is just worth exploring the Thiel, Bannon, Farage.
Yes. I mean, this is very important. Steve Bannon wasn't just his publicist. Steve Bannon was Trump's campaign manager. And then when he won, his chief of staff. He only lasted about 6-7 months in the job. And we know that he was communicating with Boris Johnson a lot in that time when he was Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary and Steve Bannon was in the White House. Steve Bannon's also co-founded Cambridge Analytica and Breitbart. He's a major figure on the alt-right. And what the documents show, again, it's very important to point this out. There's no allegation. There's no sense with Peter Thiel or with Steve Bannon of any sexual nature. It's all about politics and finance. And so with Steve Bannon, obviously, I think when he leaves, he's introduced by the American journalist and author Michael Wolff into Epstein's orbit. Wolff remains quite close to Epstein for whatever purposes, maybe journalistically, but it's not quite clear-cut why. And by this point, he's lost Trump. He's been, partly thanks to Wolff's book, he's been jettisoned from the White House. Trump's pissed off with Bannon. And he's lost his oligarch, which was Robert Mercer, founder of Renaissance Technology, who helped fund Cambridge Analytica and Breitbart. And so he's introduced to Epstein, a convicted child sex offender, in 2017. And from then on, it's their buddies, their best buddies for 2 years. And what they're real, Bannon says, I want to start a revolution in Europe now. And the beginning point of this revolution is then called the Movement, which is a set up in Brussels by Farage's partner, Laurie Ferrari, which aims to sort of get a Trump movement, a MAGA movement across Europe. And for the next 2 years, guided, given hospitality, accommodation, flights, everything, by Epstein, he travels around Europe, meeting all the far-right leaders, Salvini, who's the Five-Star Movement, in Italy, leaders of the AfD. He meets Dugin in Rome, who's the Russian ideologue. He meets Le Pen. But more than anybody, he is close to Farage. Bannon is quite clearly close to Farage. Bannon said when he left the White House, my great friend Steve Bannon has left the White House. How awful is that? He thanks Bannon and Breitbart for Brexit. And a now deleted video, he says, thanks Bannon, thanks Breitbart. Without you, we couldn't have done this, right? So Farage as his partner, starts this movement. And this movement, I don't want to go to the Bitcoin thing, it's very highly tied up with cryptocurrency, but there, in 2 occasions, so this runs until Epstein's death, constant communications with Bannon about world politics. And one of the salient bits, and I don't think it's deniable now, is that in 2018, Bannon tells Epstein, I'm trying to get them to topple Theresa May. I've been talking with Jacob Rees-Mogg, if you remember the Eurosceptic MP, with Nigel Farage and with Boris Johnson. Now, Nigel Farage said, I never had a meeting with those three. But there are separate, he's definitely talking. This report at the time is advising Johnson. There's a whole movie called The Brink where this is all documented. Him talking to Nigel Farage, watch it, The Brink, about setting up this movement, saying he's advising Johnson on toppling Theresa May when he resigned in 2018. And Michael Wolff's got email. I'm communicating on Bannon's behalf to Boris Johnson. And then when Theresa May is toppled in the summer of 2019, they're celebrating. We did it. Now that is Epstein, with Bannon's help, directly intervening in turbulent time of British politics. He's got the money, he's got the contacts. He's an extremely wealthy man. He has 2 islands. He has houses everywhere. He has contacts everywhere. That is, now, what do we know Nigel Farage knew about it? As all things Nigel Farage did, he know about Arron Banks and his 12 and Andy Wigmore and their multiple visits to the Russian embassy. He won't tell us. I find it hard to believe he didn't know, because Bannon tells him, I'll get someone to fund this. If I was Nigel Farage, who is funding this? And if maybe the word Epstein is passed. But what we have is more evidence of foreign interference in British elections. 2 Americans, at the very least, Epstein and Bannon, are successfully contributing to that turmoil, getting rid of an elected prime minister and replacing them with Boris Johnson. Now, I would just challenge any supporter of Farage, whether you believe he knew any of this stuff or not, whether he's just an innocent person when it comes to, not remembering meeting the Russian ambassador or Aaron Banks' visits to the embassy. How patriotic are you?
Has Farage said anything, Adam?
I don't believe he has. But it's interesting. I was looking back at the coverage of when Mandelson was appointed as US ambassador. And one of the first people to come out and welcome his appointment was Nigel Farage, who said, I don't agree with him everything, but I think he'd do a good job. And he offered to work with Peter Mandelson to get a good relationship with Trump. So I think obviously Farage, no stranger to shameless statements, will no doubt come out at his almost daily press conferences and attack the government over the Peter Mandelson. But at the time, he was among those saying, this is the right man for the job, and I'm happy that he's in position.
What are the next steps now then in UK politics? Where does Starmer go from here, Adam?
Well, I think the natural position in the Labour Party tends to be towards stasis. So I was speaking to a long-term critic of the Prime Minister on the left, on the Labour benches this week. And I was asking, how this is all going down with Labour MPs. He said, yeah, obviously there are lots of unhappy Labour MPs, but they've only been unhappy for a long time. And particularly amongst the new intake, which is the large portion of the Parliamentary Labour Party, they're quite scared about speaking out publicly about these things, particularly because of retribution and what it could do to their career with Mweeny still in position. And it's been such a sort of turmoil, such a period of turmoil within the Labour Party over the last year and a half. They're kind of a bit inured to it. It doesn't seem to have shifted anything to the point where there's going to be an imminent challenge against Keir Starmer. Part of the problem is that there isn't really an obvious contender to replace him. I mean, you mentioned Angela Rayner. I mean, she's still subject to investigation about her own position and why she was up from government over tax affairs. The person who looked like they were in a good position, had they been allowed to return to Parliament, would have been Andy Burnham. He's now been blocked for the foreseeable future from returning, in part because of Morgan McSweeney. Wes Streeting, again, another figure who's long been in the position at the front to overtake from Keir Starmer. He is, of course, also implicated in this. He has, in the past, been very close to Peter Mandelson. Also, in the past, not now, we understand, close to Morgan McSweeney. So he's not in a strong position as he was, a few weeks ago. So I think taking that all together, the situation is that probably Starmer is going to survive longer than people suspect. But, I just don't see how this gets any better for him. We're going to get these releases of files, the Downing Street have committed to release files. We don't know how extensive that's going to be because of the Met Police investigation. But none of that's going to be good for Downing Street. We've got the Gorton and Denton by-election coming up, which Labour looks likely, although not certain, to lose. If they lose after blocking Burnham, who probably would have won that by-election, that's another point where things can become terminal for Starmer. Got the local elections in May, again another situation where it can become terminal for Starmer. Whichever way you look, it doesn't look. It's all forcing moves for Keir Starmer. I just don't see how this ends well, although he may survive longer than we expect.
All right, Grandmaster Adam Bienkov, thank you. Any final thoughts, Peter?
No, I mean, the only is, that though this is an awful time and it's obviously bad for Mandelson and Starmer, we're always trying to look on the bright side, the light side. For my feeling, for the last 10 years, I've been looking at the turbulence, populism, especially on information warfare, all the bots, all this kind of right-wing rhetoric, the role of big tech in that, like Musk. And it is a moment of light in that and I'm sure it's not the only one, we've got pieces coming out though about what Epstein did in social media, his role in 4chan, for example, which was a source of these conspiracy theories about Pizzagate and paedophile. Oddly enough, he created theories, as a lot of the QAnon did, that all the Democrats were pedophiles, and yet it's sort of it's called pure projection, isn't it? Get this in first. There is a moment of clarity, and I think for me, as this rolls on, and it will have implications, I think, for big players, hedge funds, financiers. You just see a world of impunity. You see these men, mainly men, not all men, obviously Ghislaine Maxwell, just thinking they're above the law. And Epstein's dead, he's beyond the law. It doesn't look like much is happening in the States. But at least here, we can hold them accountable and we can see what they did.
Peter, thank you for your time. Thank you, Adam, as well. Don't forget, you can read much more from Adam and Peter in the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly news publication edited by our colleague Hardeep Mathari. Contains the best of our online articles with content that you cannot read anywhere else. So do head over to our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com, and take out a subscription if you can. And obviously follow us here on Substack as well. Thank you all, everybody who's joined in and listened and watched and made comments. We'll see you again on this channel very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.